I'm going to go first, take a few moments, turn it over to Chris, and then come back. He can correct what I say that doesn't fit theologically, and then I'll come back and correct what he does that doesn't fit economically. We'll see if that works. I'm going to play a short video here. Some of you may have seen it. That, if you want to find that, if you just Google Hans Rosling, R-O-S-L-I-N-G, 200 years, 200 countries. He's done some TED Talks, some other things, but you'll find that there. A couple of things. He's talking about a very limited period of time from an economic history point of view. I'm an economic historian, and that's how I think about those sorts of things. Second thing, development economists would not necessarily agree with his ending that just aid, trade, and green technology is all going to turn out well. One of the most difficult things for economists is to figure out how in the world do we replicate economic growth in other parts of the world, and we can talk some about that. But the thing that makes his numbers interesting, this is world per capita GDP. It's basically what economists call the hockey stick. The world goes along. These are two different sets of numbers, but basically all of the world is poor throughout most of history. Now when I say poor, that doesn't mean there aren't pockets of wealth. It doesn't mean that there aren't some economies that grow for a period of time, but there's just no sustained economic growth. So what that means is the world is very, very different. And we as Christians have to think differently about economics, about exchange, about this whole society because of these sorts of changes. Let me show you another one. This has a little more detail to it. This comes from Gregory Clark, Farewell to Alms. He shows the same hockey stick. At the very end, he divides the world into two parts. Well, you can divide it into a lot of different parts. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The first part he calls the Malthusian trap. Mainly, societies kind of run up against some sorts of constraints. They don't continue to grow. He's looking at 1800 as his baseline and looking at world income, world per capita income. So it's down, it's up, it's down, it's up. That hides quite a bit. There's great civilizations, good art, great literature. A lot of things are happening here. I mean, economists might say there's nothing going on. There is a lot going on. But in terms of sustained increases in human well-being, economically, nothing is happening. There are periods of growth. Some societies, some people in some societies experience growth, but that is just a huge change. He calls that the Industrial Revolution. We could call it that. He also talks about the Great Divergence, and that's something that we as Christians have a lot to think about in terms of parts of the world are now relatively poor compared to other parts of the world. And that is something that I think we have some real responsibilities to be concerned about. What about the great gaps in economic well-being? Now remember, those gaps don't occur because some parts of the world got dramatically poorer. They occur because some parts of the world got dramatically richer. I'm going to draw just three conclusions from this, and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and then I'll come back and do a couple more. What can we learn from this? One basic thing, of course, is that it is possible to create wealth. Back there in the world of kind of zero growth per capita income, there was still wealth-enhancing exchange, but it just wasn't happening in any great, dramatic sort of a way. Starting around 1800, we can quibble about the exact dates, we start to see massive increases in wealth defined as basically decreases in infant mortality, life expectancy. Life expectancy in 1800 in England is about 38 years. That's one of the best countries in 1800. Now, of course, worldwide it's almost 70, and the richer countries of the world is approaching 80. So that's just one of the things we have to remember. The second thing we need to remember is, in this world, the opportunities for poverty reduction are really expanded. We can introduce the poor into this world of economic growth. Now that doesn't mean that the concerns that historically the church has had for ameliorating poverty are to be forgotten, what I would call kind of the mercy ministry. So those are still crucially important and something that we as Christians need to be very actively concerned about. But it does mean that there's this whole new realm that we haven't thought a lot about because of this possibility for wealth creation. So when we think about reducing poverty, we have to think about the fact that it is possible to bring people into this world of wealth creation, productive economy, and that's just an important addition. You could say it's an addition to our arsenal of concern, or things that we ought to be thinking about. And so as we think about reducing poverty, the single most effective poverty reduction program in all of history is economic growth. And it is not left to pour out. Basically, what's happened is the people at the bottom part of the economy have grown at about the same rate as the economies overall, in the growing economies. Sometimes a little faster, sometimes a little slower, but the fundamental kind of bottom line conclusion is the bottom 10%, their incomes grow at about the rate of the economy overall. Not true for 10 or 20 year periods, but that is true for 50 or 100 year periods. And my final one here, and then it goes back to Chris. Why has this happened? This has happened because there's a set of institutions in place that recognize the fundamental dignity and worth of all people. Economic growth has occurred because of things like the rule of law, well-defined and enforced property rights. I would argue because of institutions that recognize the imago Dei, the dignity and worth of all people. And institutionally, that's unusual. Institutionally, most of the world, for most of history, has read people out of the social calculus. Reading them into the social calculus has all sorts of justice, normative sorts of things. It also has a huge impact on economic growth. Okay, I'm going to come back and do some other stuff, but Chris, you're on.
Well, what I'd like to do, this is what historians do. We make stuff messy. We get back into the ground level and see what's happening, especially at that kind of elbow or heel of that hockey stick that PJ was just talking about. I'd like to look at, briefly for the next few minutes, this is a bit more formal, but it's a case study of a particular religious group, Christian group, at that moment of industrial revolution and growing market economy. My foci here will be first Eli Halevi's thesis about the Methodist revival's social and economic impact on England, and secondly the work of E.P. Thompson on second-generation Methodist response to the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution, and a few ways that more modern commentators have interacted with, those with, I think, more of a knowledge of the messiness on the ground and the theological commitments and so on of that particular group, the Methodists in early England. What that's looked like. I think Methodism is an appropriate case study here because of its deep impact and its widespread impact on the whole culture, the whole fiber of society in England. Also because I happen to study it, so that helps. Helps to have something to do with, to know something about what you're talking about. So Halevi's book, Eli Halevi's book, England in 1815, was published 100 years ago, and it still spurs a lot of scholarly debate today. His often contested thesis is that the socially conservative nature of Methodism played a crucial role in preventing a popular uprising in England akin to the revolution in France, and helped to create an ordered and peaceful England. Noting Methodism's hierarchical structure, Halevi viewed its largely working-class devotees as malleable and easily led. Then he posited that the Methodist bourgeois leaders in fact led the movement and its members to seek spiritual rather than temporal solutions to the difficulties they faced in the time of Methodism's 18th century birth and its first flourishing. So we're backing up a bit here. Wesley, you may know, the revival really begins to take off in the 1730s, 1740s. And so Halevi actually saw, and I think this is, I'm not enough of an economic historian, we can maybe address this, but that seems to be at least a nascent period of some of the changes that are going to lead up to full-blown industrialization. In particular, Halevi took 1739, a year in which the established order was threatened by political and economic crises and strikes and riots on all sides, as a key moment. And he noted that that same year also saw an outbreak of enthusiastic Christianity under such Methodist preachers as Wesley and Whitefield. The result of the revival was to turn the minds of the new converts, Halevi posited, away from the oppressive conditions in which they worked and towards their eternal destinies. So for Halevi, these Methodist workers were essentially sheep, led from above in a direction that distracted them from economic realities to spiritual realities. Their inherent conservatism was ensured by the conservatism of their bourgeois pastors, the royalist Wesley included. Halevi made no bones about it. Methodism changed everything about English society. The movement's bedrock morality, voluntary obedience to a freely constituted religious organization, seeped into all the institutions and ideas of England, her science, art, literature, education, political debate, and economy. All of this influenced the broader culture of England because the movement successfully jumped fences into other dissenting churches and especially into the established church itself. While repudiating the name of Methodist, many members of the ruling class accepted Methodism's teachings, and in the case of Wilberforce and his friends in the House of Commons, forged a deep and lasting impact on English society. According to Halevi, the established evangelicals returned the favor by leading, and when I use evangelicals here now, I mean the technical sense, Anglican evangelicals, those who are in the established church, returned the favor. Let's see if I can find it. Oh yes, by leading Methodism increasingly to accept the middle class outlook. For the evangelicals found no contradiction between advancing the nation's morals and commercial gain. With this realization, Halevi argued, Methodism began broadening from a sectarian cult to something like a national faith, a civil religion. And I would say there's a close parallel to what goes on in America, only it's a delayed response. It begins to happen in America in the early 1800s. In short, Methodism eventually transmuted into a social ethic with long-lasting social consequences. I think I said that. While Halevi's thesis was suggestive, contemporary critics have often pointed out that it suffered from a lack of on-the-ground data. For example, one crucial place he misstepped was in his assumption that it was an elite Methodist leadership that inculcated these values into a dependent working-class followership. On the contrary, first, many, if not most, early Methodist leaders were drawn from the working classes. From the beginning, the movement was marked by a grassroots dynamic. The rank-and-file Methodists had a strong sense of ownership of local institutions, including their class meetings and Sunday schools, in which working folk were active participants and leaders. Working-class adherents enjoyed a kind of spiritual egalitarianism that spurred them to lead a wide array of efforts into spiritual and social reform. For example, in Sabbatarianism, Bible distribution, and the abolition of the slave trade. One of the most flourishing trades in America when the Methodist period happens in America, I know the American story a bit better than the British even, was coal porters, traveling Bible salesmen. And many of those were Methodist circuit riders who, while they were there, kind of kept body and soul together. Circuit riding was not a remunerative discipline. Now, of course, pastors are paid huge amounts, so it's not a problem. Ended up selling books across the country and sparking a massive increase in flourishing and technology of the publishing and printing enterprise overall. Abolition of the slave trade was another one of those efforts of social reform. Second, those working class adherents very quickly started to move up the economic ladder. Classic study of that is Niebuhr's Social Sources of Denominationalism. I don't remember how it goes. A Methodist is a Baptist with shoes, a Presbyterian is a Methodist with a bank account, an Episcopalian is a Presbyterian with a stock portfolio, something like that. Anyway, there's this sort of increase of what happens when you practice these essential virtues, this sort of basic morality, this development of trust. PJ was talking with us earlier about how vital trust is for the operation of the successful operation of a market economy. And so there were these virtues that weren't really noticed by Halevi because he was focusing on the leaders and assuming that this was something that was imposed downward. Behind this independent activism and social mobility lay Methodism's Arminian emphasis on the role of each person in their own salvation. We hear the economic as well as political results of this theology in the foremost theologian of the early 19th century, a Methodist theologian of the early 19th century, Richard Watson, who argued as follows. Listen to this language, it's really interesting. A religious man must not become a factious man and must avoid all association with low and violent men, the rabble of a state and their designing leaders. Instead, true Christianity, when applied by a faithful Christian laborer, was to turn darkness into light, confusion to order, shamelessness to character, squalidness to decency, prodigality to frugality, improvidence to foresight, and sloth to industry. Interesting language. All of that protection of both order and freedom within society would support, and this was the primary end, the great end of the Christianizing of the world. We may note that these same values would also help lay the groundwork for the growth of market capitalism. Now we turn to the work of E.P. Thompson. I'm going to try to keep within my time here. I believe I will successfully do that. He was a socialist historian and an activist whose portrayal of second-generation Methodism, maybe third generation, after Wesley's death in any case in 1791, has been cited in almost every serious history of Methodism since its time. So it's interesting that this is an example in which somebody with an economic thesis about a particular religious movement has been duly noted and debated and ingested by church historians ever since. So I like to think historians are kind of a broad cadre, one might say parasitic on everybody else's discipline, but I wouldn't. And so we're open to these kinds of input from other disciplines. And I think that's one of the virtues of history as we do it. As we'll see, Thompson's thesis bore some resemblance to Halevy's arguments from which his ideas grew, but it took new directions. Though he was exposed himself directly to very little of contemporary Methodism, he did struggle with his own family's Methodist heritage, which included a Methodist missionary grandfather on his father's side. However, his father and himself were men of socialist sympathies who professed to having, the junior, E.P. Thompson, who wrote the book, professed to having been brought up as a dissident who joined his father in finding Methodism especially irksome in its, quote, otherworldly fear of political activism. Like the English evangelicals from whom he doubtless absorbed the trait, however unconsciously, Thompson believed passionately that people needed to exercise personal responsibility and stand strong against defeatism and apathy. This helped him to become, I think, a bit of a speckled bird among Marxist historians, for he was quite willing to acknowledge the motivating power of religious ideas in the organizational, economic, as well as personal and cultural lives of historical actors. Unlike other Marxist historians, he was not an economic determinist in that sense. In the famous 11th chapter of his 1963 magnum opus, The Making of the English Working Class, titled The Transforming Power of the Cross, Thompson vented his distaste for Methodism with full rhetorical vigor. The resulting account has become, along with Halevy's work, the most important influence on the writing of the history of Methodism in the early Industrial Revolution. Thompson portrayed Methodism of this time, post-Wesley, by its intense otherworldliness and how it left its members helpless against the age's dehumanizing industrialization and political repression. He decried the Methodist movement as religious terrorism, grimly portraying its box-like blackening chapels, and describing with exasperation bordering on horror the supposed psychic masturbation of its emotionally charged worship services with their Sabbath orgasms of feeling. His words, not mine. Most important for our purposes today, Thompson probed and pried and analyzed, trying to figure out how Methodism had impacted the transformative time of the Industrial Revolution as it rose up on the English landscape in the generation after Wesley's death. So, a lot of people have noticed this. They kind of rise up at the same time, so what's going on there? Unlike Halevy, Thompson saw working class Methodists as quite actively engaged in forging their own religious views and actions. Unfortunately, in Thompson's view, where those views took the Methodists was into a dark, dysfunctional chiliasm of despair, a millennial passion that absorbed and transformed all of its day's radical political impulses, which might more appropriately have been marshaled to rage against the machine of industrial capitalism, in Thompson's view. So far, this may seem a straw man caricature of the Methodist movement, but Thompson did recognize the many tensions in the heart of Wesleyanism. True, he argued that after Wesley's death in 1791, the emotional worship and essential social conservatism his followers inherited from him mired them in this submission to ecclesiastical authoritarianism. Everybody noticed the Methodists had bishops, and that meant that was bad. But he also recognized that it preached the spiritual, if not material, equality of all people, a potentially uplifting doctrine. And while he dismissed the movement's battle against pubs and frivolities as a kind of works righteousness, arising from an obsessive fear of backsliding, he did appreciate the potentially freeing effect of its message of free grace. But in the end, Thompson viewed Methodism as a near demonic trap that deified ceaseless, joyless work, making it a religious duty, and thus transforming its adherents into willing drones in the factories of the evil industrialists. In his own phrase, Methodism turned the laborer into his own slave driver. It was the Methodist movement, he argued, that saved exploitative industrial capitalism from the kind of radical uprising it so richly deserved. Like Halevy's thesis, Thompson's is still discussed today, as I said. In one trenchant essay, Methodist historians David Hempton and John Walsh analyzed Thompson's interpretation, laying out the fact of the matters to see whether Thompson's thesis holds. What they discover is a set of realities that Thompson had largely ignored, which together paint a rather different picture of early 19th century Methodism's relationship with the economic conditions of the time. It turns out that those are some of the same things that Halevy also missed. It's true that timid conservative leaders of many Methodist conferences swore again and again to the political and economic loyalty of their people, expelling, for instance, the rabble-rousing Luddites who broke machinery and raged against the industrialists. However, as I've hinted in talking about Halevy, the movement's evangelistic success created another quite different culture in the England of its day. This was true because far from being the authoritarian, episcopally controlled machine of Thompson's imagining, Methodism was in fact quite loose and open. Again, though pastors might lean on their congregations in some of the bigger towns, everywhere else, which was where the majority of Methodists worshiped, it was the class leader and the circuit-riding preacher who determined the culture of the movement. And as Hempton and Walsh put it, on any given Sunday, the great majority of Methodist pulpits were occupied by local part-timers, usually working men. In fact, nearly 60% of Methodist members were skilled craftsmen, workers who enjoyed relative independence and sought decency and self-respect in their work. You'll likely remember that the revivalism that brought such men and women into Methodism in such great numbers made many of Britain's established churchly and political leaders nervous. Recall, for example, those famous images of John Wesley preaching in the town square and getting himself pelted with eggs and stones for his troubles. Certainly the local parson and squire had reason to worry. After all, with the rules of the land that allowed non-conforming churches to operate in the very shadow of the established Church of England, Methodism represented a free market religious expression. It was a purely voluntary association, freely supported and freely abandoned, much more like the sturdy, free-born English worker, shrewd, self-reliant, not easily fooled, who Thompson admired, than like a group of beaten and cowed subjects of religious terrorism, who turned all their attention and emotion to religious experience, thus canalizing their energy into safe channels. Walsh and Hempton argued that Methodism's huge army of unpaid local lay officers made it an adaptive as well as an innovative force. Even its famous lectures against drunkenness and sermons on responsibility that Thompson found so suited to creating docile, sober, industrious workers for the evil factories were actually not imposed from above, but rather came from the bottom of the movement. Sometimes this gave the more conservative leaders within the Wesleyan Conference pause, as when they found themselves in 1841 moving to ban temperance speakers from their chapels as potential extremists. At other times, the new morally informed freedom and ambition of the Methodists took more conservative social and economic forms. Famously, many of the miners of Cornwall, even mine bosses, were Methodist lay preachers whose communal cohesion and Christian virtues changed the way they did business with other workers and with management. Whatever the case, this growing Methodism does not look much like Halevy's portrait of a religion used by bourgeois leaders to exercise social control over working class followers. I did my doctoral work in American Christian history, and almost any time you got into this conversation about culture, social impacts of religion, and vice versa, you immediately got the social control theory, which says that the more comfortable higher classes were quite happy to have the lower classes become evangelical because it made them into these more docile workers. So I'm not seeing a lot of evidence of that in the data, despite the theories that we've been talking about. So to sum up, what Hempton and Walsh found was that the quest for self-control, industriousness, and improvement, as well as a keen sense of the dignity of labor, characterized the hardy artisans who populated many a local Methodist society, controlling not only where they worship, but also many aspects of their work life, even in the mines and in the tin works and the textile factories. Far from developing a slavish devotion to labor for its own sake, Thompson's thesis is a sort of masochistic, religiously nervous penance that turned workers into their own slave drivers, it seems that the Methodist societies attracted many of their freely and voluntarily involved worshipers precisely through their offer of a more purposeful, disciplined way of life. And many workers responded, at least in part, because they found the industriousness and financial prudence preached by the movement to be a solid means for self-improvement and material success. Far from being an economically retrograde movement, Methodism was laying the groundwork for marketplace success for its adherents. If I had more time, we could take that into America, and it's amply demonstrated. Much work has yet to be done to show how exactly the liberty, release, fellowship, discipline, and emphasis on personal moral responsibility of this large and growing Methodist movement truly affected the economic sphere in the early Industrial Revolution. But we may believe it had something of the same force and liberating power as the anti-slavery movement, in which many of them also participated. In short, at times Methodists did resist the new industrial order, and at many other times they embraced it for Methodist reasons. But in both cases, the truth of Methodism's interaction with the industrial economy reaches far beyond the supposed abject capitulation portrayed by Halevi and Thompson, and since then, by many others wanting to understand the social dimensions of this and other evangelical movements. Thank you.
If we come back to that last point, what's going on economically is that this recognition of moral equality of all people, and then putting that into the institutional framework, really becomes the ground of economic growth. So you could take a very instrumentalist approach to things like putting in place the Imago Dei in terms of the institutions, but it also has a whole bunch of moral implications. But that last point, we'd spend a lot more time on. I'm happy to spend time on it in the question and answer period. But it's changing the institutions. And so when we talk about what's called the Industrial Revolution, it really should be called the institutional revolution that recognizes the dignity and worth of all people. Okay, a few more things here to try to bring this together. What are the implications for a modern globalized economy? I've spent some time on the first one. Substantial wealth creation is possible, occurs. An important one that we need to recognize. It may have some sorts of problems with it also. One of the interesting sorts of things is this thinking about work as an opportunity for service. And what happens in the modern industrialized economy is people serve many other people in a manifold ways that were not possible before. People are related to other people through the economic system, through the economic signals that are sent, that allow exchange to occur across time and space, and this becomes impersonal exchange, which has some sorts of problems, but it's basically exchange with people that you don't know. But if you think of work as both having a purpose in terms of generating income for yourself and your family, but as an opportunity to serve, in this modern economy, the service opportunities are greatly expanded. You are servicing people that you will never see, and in ways that are hard to put your get your mind around, but they are opportunities for service. So that's just a huge expansion in terms of what goes on there. So the economic signals are really important. However, we can't just pay attention to the economic signals. We have to have some sort of a moral framework for evaluating these sorts of signals. And one of the problems of modern economics is it just takes the signals as the only important sort of a thing that we ought to be thinking about. You have to have a moral framework for processing those sorts of signals and deciding which are the appropriate ones that you want to look at. How should you process them? I think the labor market, the wages that are paid to people, the signals that tell graduates of colleges or people that just finish high school where their best places to work are, those are very important signals. But I would hope that people don't just look at those signals. There's lots of other sorts of things that need to go into human flourishing, and that's one of the things that the church has to provide. It has to be intentional about telling us how do we work with those signals. I don't think we should abolish the signals, but I think that we ought to be very intentional about processing them. One of the sorts of things that's happened is we've got greater income inequality than ever before. If you go back to that Hans Rosling slide, one of the things you notice is where did it start in 1810? Well, the world was relatively equal. Where is it today? It is much more unequal. I wish that weren't the case. It would be nice if it were the case that economic well-being was available for all people in the world. But we are a much more unequal world than we are in 1800. Is it a worse world? I don't think so, but it is unequal. And it's unequal because economic growth has occurred in certain places and not in other sorts of places. And so that the inequality thing is a fact. How you evaluate that may be compared to what? What's the alternative? How are we going to think about the world, for instance, without economic growth? The other sort of a problem that comes about with the modern growth economy is that exit becomes so easy. What happens, of course, is that people can exit the family, they can exit the community, they can exit the church because we're well enough off that you can support yourself without many of the traditional forms of relationship that exist. And traditionally, if you were going to leave your community and you were just an ordinary person, boy, you were going to be cast into a pretty difficult sort of a situation. Today, people that want to declare themselves free from all the ameliorating institutions of life, they can make it economically, And so I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes exit is really nice when you can exit oppressive sorts of situations, but it raises all sorts of interesting questions because of what I would call the thinning of institutions. And that's, again, a place that the church has to be very cognizant of and try to step into that breach and provide meaningful relationships, meaningful institutions, because the exit option comes so easily now. Because we are so wealthy that people that want to try to create, I don't think they can, but they try to create a life for themselves completely independent of anything in the past or any social relationships that they've had in the past. And that's at least economically possible. And so I think that just means that the church has a much larger responsibility there because of the exit option. And then my final point, wealth creation, I think it's a great blessing. It's a sort of a thing that I think the ability to create order out of chaos, to envision how you can change the world in ways that create wealth, all those sorts of things, I think it's part of the goodness of God to make that available to us. Are we capable of turning blessings into curses? We really are, aren't we? And so the problems of materialism, hedonism, being workaholics, that comes along with the modern economy. And so we have to be very, very thoughtful as we think about this wealthy world and how we as Christians are going to interact in that, what's going to be taught in terms of institutions, in terms of seminaries, educational institutions, what the church is going to be doing, because again, we want to be cognizant of God's desire to bless us, but how we take those blessings and make them into curses. So, I'm going to stop there.